Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins, sitting in for Mike Papantonio this week. Coming up on today's show, we'll tell you what's really driving the racist rants of Republican lawmakers. We'll also tell you about the recently uncovered fraud handbook that Wells Fargo used to illegally foreclose on homeowners. And Pap and Sam Seder will run through some of the biggest stories that the corporate-controlled media missed this past week. We have all that and more coming up, but right now, you've stepped into the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
Republican ideological leaders like Paul Ryan and Rand Paul have been making headlines recently for making racially charged statements during media appearances and stump speeches. But the problem goes well beyond the racist foundations of the Republican Party, and it's actually part of their strategy to destroy social safety net programs designed to keep people out of poverty. Joining me now to talk about this is Howard Nations. So Howard, Republicans today are talking as if they were living back in the 1950s, 1960s, or possibly even the 1940s. This racist tone that they're taking, all over the country, this isn't anything new, is it? I mean, we've seen this for decades now, haven't we?
Well, the Republican Party has a very firm racist foundation, starting particularly in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act and in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act, when President Johnson said when he signed it, "I fear that we have lost the South to the Republican Party for the next generation." He was a couple of generations off, because what happened was when he signed those two bills, there was a mass exodus in the South from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party because of the rights granted to minorities. The solid South, and it was as solid Democratic as you could be, became solid Republican. When I was raised in the South, there was a term about yellow dog Democrats, and the phrase was you could elect your yellow dog to the governor's seat if you ran him as a Democrat. Well, that changed in 1964 with the signing of the Civil Rights Act. So based primarily on race issues, the South shifted from Democrat to Republican.
And then they learned how to harness that resentment for the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, and that has been their strategy ever since. I know Lee Atwater, obviously one of the most famous people, but he really took it and ran with it and perfected it, didn't he?
He certainly did. There's a famous interview with Lee Atwater in 1982 when he was talking to a political scientist when he was explaining that, and I'm going to change he used the N-word. I'm going to change it to black. He said, you start out in 1954 by saying black, black, black. By 1968, I can't say black. That backfires. It hurts you. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you talk about cutting taxes. These are totally economic issues, but the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. So it was a very strong strategy that was racially based.
And so then it evolved from there. We got into Ronald Reagan, with his image of the welfare queen, and then even with George H.W. Bush with the whole Willie Horton attack. So, this concept of GOP racism, I know a lot of members of the Republican Party want to jump out and say, we are not racist, that you're making this up. But no, go back and look at the history that you've just described. This is all real. This is all verifiable. And this is what this party was founded on. And so here we are today, 45 years past. Has anything at all changed from those Lee Atwater and Ronald Reagan welfare queen images today?
That's an extremely good question, and there are two answers to it. And to get to one of the answers, let's look a little closer at Ronald Reagan, the hero of the Republican Party. Remember that Ronald Reagan opened his presidential campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the site of the murder of civil rights activists Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. Just think about that. Then he campaigned, as you said, against the welfare queens. Reagan was famous for being quoted on the statement that he made to several audiences when he was campaigning in the South talking about that it was frustrating to stand in line behind strapping young bucks buying T-bones with food stamps. This is still the president that's most admired today by today's Republicans. And I remember that Atwater, who was the founder of the Southern Strategy, joined Roger Ailes as creator, who's the creator of the Fox echo chamber, in that whole Willie Horton strategy that was very instrumental, total racism, very instrumental in getting George H.W. Bush elected president. Roger Ailes is still at it. Just tune into Fox News any day. So has it changed today? There's a theory, the theory that it has is that today the racist underpinnings of the Republican Party are not really the goal. It's not racism, that the goal is to attack the safety net. The goal is to attack the food stamps and the recipients of food stamps, and that the racism today is a byproduct. I don't agree with that. I agree that that may be one goal, but the second goal of stirring up racism for the sheer sake of racism, for attacking minorities, is still alive and well, certainly in the South.
Right. And so you do have these folks. I know Paul Ryan is Wisconsin, but he recently came under fire when he said, we have these lazy inner city people who are dragging the economy down. They don't want to work. They just want to live off the government forever and ever. And that is one of the things that really sparked this whole renewal of the Republican racism. But if you look past that, it's certainly not the first instance, and it's not going to be the last. We have business leaders. We have Republican candidates who've said that I think KKK-owned businesses should be allowed to ban blacks. We have other Republicans out there who are saying, these lazy welfare recipients are no good. We have people like George Zimmerman out there at gun shows signing autographs. This, racism is at the heart of all this. And I agree with you completely. I think that you have the racism factor, and then also separately, you do have the attacks on social safety nets, which we're seeing coming from the Republicans on a daily basis. But they're trying to merge the two, and it's not working, is it?
No, look what's happening to your voter ID requirements today. They cut back on early voting, especially on Sundays, on the Sunday before elections. What is the purpose of that? Black churches had the Souls to the Polls campaigns, where they would take people directly from the churches to the polls because they could vote on Sunday. They eliminated that in several states. How is that not racism? In Arizona and Kansas, ID and proof of citizenship was recently upheld by a federal judge as a requisite for voting. Now, that's disproportionately affects minorities, but it also is a direct attack on minorities themselves as minorities. So,
you get into this voter ID issue, and I wanted to tackle one of the prevailing myths that Republicans have is, if you're a citizen, you have an ID, because obviously you can't get on an airplane if you don't have an ID. You can't drive a car if you don't have a photo ID. But what they don't understand is a lot of these people, obviously, if they don't have enough money for an ID, they're not flying around the country. They're not going on vacation. Most of them do not have cars. They live in an area where they can either walk where they need to go or they hop on public transportation. And so, yes, those voter ID laws do disproportionately affect minority, low-income voters all over the country. And we're seeing it especially bad down here in the South. I know we're in a horrible red part of Florida. You're in Texas. We see this firsthand, and you do see writers, you see phenomenal writers who say that, look, it's not really about racism. They're really just attacking the social safety net. And in some instances, in some places, that may be true. But I know what you see in your hometown, what we see in our hometown, is purely race-driven.
Yeah, let's look at Texas. They just passed a voter ID in the last legislative session, which is totally Republican-dominated, which said that a gun license is a valid ID, but a student ID from Texas University isn't. They're attacking two things there. One is that they are trying to eliminate the as much of the minority voting as possible because those people don't have IDs. But secondly, they're attacking the students. And they're attacking the students because the millennials are voting heavily Democratic. And they were one of the major reasons for Obama's victory. And they're one of the major reasons why, if there is to be a resurgence in Texas of the Democratic Party, the millennials will play a very important part of that. So they also invoked a rule saying that if you live on campus at the University of Texas and you've been there 4 years, you're a senior, you're not really you can't vote in that county. You have to go back to your home district. Are kids going to take a day off from school to drive back to their home district or fly home to vote? No. So it's all attacks on not just minorities, it's attacks on students. That part of it is the pro-Republican part. That's the part about building the very strong Republican Party, Republican supremacy. But the other part, the racial gerrymandering, redistricting blacks into the fewest number of districts they can get, is very much a part of making sure that they have the fewest members of minorities elected to either Congress or state legislatures or anything that requires a strong voter turnout.
Well, and so real quick here, do you see this problem of the Republican racism, do you see it going away with the new generation coming up? I mean, are we going to see in 15, 20 years from now this whole racism issue kind of dying down within the party, or do you think that it's just going to hold over and continue to be an issue?
Well, the millennials identify themselves very much as more so with the Democratic Party than with the Republican Party. Racism is dying off with the new generation. However, as many of the Southern strong white racist voters are elderly. And so will there be a change because the elderly white Southern racists who were raised from cradle to grave with racism, are dying off and being replaced by millennials? Will it probably happen? Yes. Will it take decades to come? Yes.
Howard, thank you very much for your insight on this topic. We certainly appreciate it.
My pleasure, friend.
Wells Fargo, the largest mortgage servicing company in the country, was recently busted for creating and sharing a handbook that instructed their employees on how to commit fraud. Joining me now to tell us this story is attorney Michael Burg. So, Michael, this past week, Wells Fargo was already in the middle of one lawsuit, and it came out during that suit that they basically have this handbook, this manual of how to commit fraud. I mean, there's no other way to really put that. They have a manual on how to commit fraud. Tell us this story. This is a very remarkable story that people need to know about.
It is, Farron, but I must tell you, they're not alone. The fraud that's committed in terms of these foreclosures are with all the major banks. But the bombshell that was dropped, that there's a 150-page manual that Wells Fargo issued in November of 2011 and then modified it in February of 2012, which basically tells attorneys how to fake documents, how to put forth fake documents, sign them, endorse them, even though the borrowers may never, or they don't have the original documents, to allow them to go forward with a foreclosure. It's so outrageous, it's unbelievable, but it's been going on since the huge, giant mortgage and housing crisis and the crash that occurred, and it's going on throughout the entire country.
So we've already had, millions of people that have lost their homes since the crash in, late 2007, 2008. And now we're finding out, just as we have through other lawsuits, that a lot of this has been based on fraud. Now, this handbook, these forged documents, what exactly did that entail? What would it allow Wells Fargo to do?
Well, in many different levels. There's an endorsement note that they fill out in blank, which shows the transfer. What happens to these mortgages when you enter into a mortgage, it is unlikely that the original mortgage holder is going to end up with your loan. What they do is they sell these, and they package them up, and they sell them in bulk, and they discount them, and other banks take them. But in order for them to foreclose against you, they have to have the original documents. They have to have the note, they have to have the mortgage or the deed of trust, and they have to have a transfer document, an endorsement that endorses it over. And in most cases, those documents either are lost or they're never transferred, and the people doing the banks, the large banks like Wells Fargo, doing the foreclosure don't have them. And so what this book says to the lawyer is here how you put those documents in front of a court to get the foreclosure to go through by phoning them up, faking out blank endorsements, writing them out, forging the notes. It is unbelievable. What people don't understand is this. 25 billion, 49 attorney generals went after almost every major bank, including Wells Fargo. There was a $25 billion settlement for these kinds of fraudulent practices, but nothing to help the homeowners. That's what's so crazy. It's the same thing. I was at a meeting with a guy who was at the Fed who is asked to remain anonymous. And what was amazing is when they did the bailout, is that they bailed out the banks. They bailed out Freddie and Fannie. They bailed out even the mortgage brokers, but they never bailed out the homeowners. The homeowners are the ones who took the biggest hit, and they could have bailed them out by not allowing these foreclosures to go through in the first place. Had the government taken over the loans and reduced the interest rates, and this was discussed, and I found this out from an anonymous source who won't be revealed at the Fed. They discussed it, that they could reduce the interest rates and allow people to continue to pay on their mortgages. But the big banks were against it. And in order to do that, they would have to have the bank's consent to either nationalize the bank or take over the mortgages, and the banks wouldn't do it. And so what they did instead, which goes to the greed in America and what's going on with these big giant national banks like Wells Fargo, they said, well, what we'll do is we'll phony up the documents that we don't have, and we're going to put out a handbook about it to basically take the homes of the innocent home buyers who at the time, because they did those short-term loans, which then when the interest rate rised, they couldn't afford to make the payments anymore. Just outrageous what's going on to the American people.
And in the stories, it says that these lawyers would refer to these, or they were referred to as these ta-da documents, because they would initially make the court filing, the documents would not be there, and then suddenly, oh, here's the documents, we do have them, and it's because they were fraudulent. They had gone back, they had essentially forged these documents because, again, they knew how. I mean, they might as well have been holding giant weekend training sessions, come to fraud camp, and we'll teach you how to do this. I mean, that's the extent of what's happening here. And a lot of this, we would not know of had initial lawsuits not been filed. And at this point, now that we do know this information, now that we have this very hard evidence that this is what was happening, is there any recourse for the people who were foreclosed upon, or is there any way for them to even know if it was fraud in their case?
First of all, they probably won't know. So you're right there, Farron, that they're not going to know. Their home is gone. They've probably gone through bankruptcy. And they're the ones who basically have been put in a position where they're the ones who are getting the horrible treatment with regard to these fraudulent documents. But I will tell you that as a result of many lawsuits, here in Colorado, for example, we filed a number of lawsuits under this where they didn't find the ta-da documents, where all of a sudden they brought them. And we fortunately had a few judges who said, now, wait a second, I want to find out what's going on. And recently, and it took many years, a number of the lawyers have either been suspended from the practice of law or have had their license taken. And that's what should happen. I mean, not only do we first of all, that we may not be able to get recourse for all those foreclosed homes that have already gone down the road, but those lawyers and these banks have to be held accountable for what they're doing. The lawyers should be disbarred or suspended, because if they participated in falsifying, forgery, and fake documents, they should lose their license, or at least at a minimum be suspended, regardless of what firm they're with, no matter what bank they're with. That should happen, and it should happen right now.
So everything we've talked about, we have forgery, we have filing fake documents in a court. If I were to do that as a person, we're right across the street from the courthouse, if I were to walk over there and say, oh, here's a letter saying that I bought this car, and I completely forged it, and I wanted them to notarize it, I, as a human being, as a person, would go to prison.
You would be in jail.
That is illegal. Now, we have these major banks like Wells Fargo, and as you pointed out earlier, Wells Fargo is certainly not the only one that's done this. I mean, they just happen to be the big ones right now, and we've got their book. But is there any chance at all that anybody at that bank, from the person in the mailroom to the guy at the top of the CEO there, is there any chance any of these guys will get anything more than a slap in the wrist?
Well, if history predicts what's going to happen in the future, unfortunately, the answer is no. The Attorney General of the United States, Attorney General Holder, has basically failed to prosecute. We may find some attorney generals in the state, like, for example, in Minnesota, where we saw a lot of the TADA documents were actually being produced. We may get something done there, but on a federal government standpoint, they've not sent anybody to jail. If you want to stop the kind of things we've been talking about on this show, and more specifically, this kind of incredibly reckless and horrible, illegal activity, somebody has to go to jail. And that's the only way it's going to work. And rather than paying, I'm sorry, the $25 billion for the banks to pay the fine to the AGs, that's all good and well. But it doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't solve the problem because the only way you're going to have a deterrent effect is sending these people, just like you and I, if we went in like you discussed, we forged a document, we'd be in jail. We'd be prosecuted. I don't care how big the bank is, they need to be prosecuted. Somebody has to be made an example of it so it doesn't happen again.
Well, and what we have, Eric Holder, as you mentioned, he came from corporate law firms. If you look at the roster of clients from Covington and Burling, where he came from, Bank of America is on there. Other big banks and these securities giants who have just committed fraud after fraud after fraud. They're all his former clients. He made tons of money going to court and saying, look, what they did, it's not so bad. And now he is the one who's in charge of going out there and saying, we need to hold these people accountable. And that's why we've seen absolutely none of this hope and change that Obama had promised, because he surrounded himself with these corporate Democrats like Eric Holder, who refuse to do anything about anything. Because Eric Holder knows, 2-3 years from now, he's got to go back to private practice. Where's he going to go? He's probably going right back to Covington Burling, and he can't, hold his friends accountable when he knows in a couple years he's going to be sitting in a courtroom defending them again. And that's the problem I see with the whole situation, is just this massive revolving door.
My partner, Alan Simpson, said to me, you know what, country first. And he's led his life that way. He's a Republican, but country first. More important than money, more important than party, more important than anything. And that's the problem right now. And I'm asking our viewers to get out there, and you write your congressman, your senator, you write the president of the United States, and you write Holder, and you say to him, look, you must hold these people accountable. And whether it's with regard to the securitization and the fraud that occurred on Wall Street, too big to fail, too big to jail, not in America. We can't allow that to happen. And the only way it's going to ever change, because you're right, Holder, he's a Covington guy, he's a big firm guy. Obama, big firm, big corporation guy. It's unbelievable. Even off the subject, Obama has used Williams and Connolly to help vet his judicial appointments, a big giant law firm, to decide whether or not someone's going to go on the federal bench for life. That is disgraceful, and the public has to do something about it. Be outraged by we're allowing these documents to magically appear as a result of forgery and having no one go to jail for it.
Michael, your enthusiasm on this is exactly what every American needs to have right now. They need to be angry. They need to get active. They need to get out there. I certainly appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Farron.
Earlier this week, Mike Papantonio and Sam Seder discussed some of the biggest news stories that the corporate-controlled media missed this week. Let's take a look at some of those stories that you won't hear from the mainstream media.
So, Pap, obviously big news this week were the oral arguments in the Hobby Lobby case in front of the Supreme Court. I'm very curious as to get your reactions to what we heard in those oral arguments and just the case in general.
Well, I think what you're going to see, if I were to make predictions, it would be that they're probably in some way going to find for Hobby Lobby, but it won't be based on constitutional grounds. That would be my guess. The closer the Supreme Court gets towards calling a corporation a person, they get close to this idea of piercing the corporate veil. And what that means is the corporation has protection from the owner of a corporation has and the shareholders have protection from being sued or being pulled into bankruptcy or being in any way hit for regulatory misconduct, because they have a corporation put together that protects them from that. It veils them from that. So now the closer you get to the closer this U.S. Supreme Court gets to saying that a corporation is a person, you destroy that veil protection. I'll be one of the first people that'll bring I can promise you, if this goes and they base it on personhood of a corporation has the right to have religious freedoms protected as a corporation, I'll be the first one to start suing the CEO of the company, the shareholders directly, name them in the lawsuit, getting judgments against them personally.
All right, wait, we should back up just to give people some basic understanding of the case. Essentially, you have this company which has about 14,000 employees. They provide insurance for their employees. And under the Affordable Care Act, all insurance now must provide for reduced cost contraceptive care for women. And Hobby Lobby apparently had insurance that already had provided that. They weren't aware of it until they were contacted by some right-wing activists who were shopping around for plaintiffs. And they claim that they are subject to a mandate. Even though the mandate is actually not on them, the mandate's on the insurance company. They don't have to provide insurance for their employees. They could pay a tax if they wanted to get out from under that, which is one of the issues, obviously in the case. And they are under this RFRA, this Religious Freedom Act that passed in the 90s. They're claiming that and this is what you're talking about in terms of this corporate veil. They're claiming that even though the corporation is a secular corporation, it's in business to provide crafts stuff and sells in the sort of our public economy, they're claiming that the religion of the owners basically, I guess, transmutes to the corporate body?
No. They're saying the corporation itself has a religious aspect to it, that it has a religious entity about it. It's a constitutional argument. They're saying that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that you were talking about came about because in 1990 the Supreme Court made a ridiculous decision. They decided that the Native Americans, who we used to use peyote as a religious ceremony, that the peyote could be used in the religious ceremony legally. Well, the Supreme Court stepped into that, and they said, no, you really can't do that, because if you did, then every oddity about every religion would be tested and tried and would seek protection under religious freedom. So then the Congress responds, and then they write the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and it was created because of that peyote decision, okay? Now, what Hobby Lobby's doing is they're trying to use that Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and they're trying to say, look, a corporation has a religious identity to it, and our religious identity does not allow us it doesn't morally permit us to sell something or to be part of something where we are encouraging abortion. They're equating birth control to abortion. That's the other weird part of this thing.
Right.
Now, the point is, the justices you've got to remember, you've got the five morons, the majority Republican moron of this court that has always 90+% of the time, this is a majority that sides with corporate America. The interesting thing about this case, corporate America doesn't want Hobby Lobby to win on constitutional grounds. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has failed to get involved here. The Fortune 500 corporations have failed to even file an amicus brief because they're afraid that if the Supreme Court does the unthinkable, and that is to say, not only does a corporation have a First Amendment right, but a corporation has a constitutional protection for their religious beliefs, that gets to the point to where you say, okay, well, there is no separateness. There's no distinction. There's no separateness between the corporation and the owners of the corporation or the shareholders. And so when you get to that, then they become a target in bankruptcy issues and in contract liability and tort liability because there's no separateness. They're the same
And by
thing.
they, you mean actually the individuals
Yes, the
who
owners
did
of the
the
corporation.
incorporating as opposed to the corporation. I mean, this is fascinating because you don't hear this analysis anywhere else, frankly, because.
Well, I'm looking at it from the standpoint, I can promise you I will be the first one to bring the lawsuits.
It comes from obviously your perspective as an attorney that this is one part of the veneer that will be shed away that insulates owners of a company from any type of liability for what their corporation does.
Yeah, it's called separateness, and the separateness says that the Greens, the family that owns this Hobby Lobby, they can have their religion, they can have their First Amendment speech as individuals, but where it comes to the corporation, this fictional thing they created called the Hobby Lobby that's incorporated, this corporation gives them protection in that you can sue Hobby Lobby if the Hobby Lobby causes somebody if it causes somebody to trip and fall, let's say slip and fall in Hobby Lobby. Well, you don't sue the Greens. You sue Hobby Lobby, the corporation, because the separateness is that the corporation is not the Greens. Now, as you move closer and closer to the flame here, which now we have Citizens United that says the corporation has a First Amendment right. You have them testing. You have other cases that are continuing to test whether they have a Fourth Amendment right on search and seizure, whether they have, how expansive are the individual rights to where the corporation is no longer a separate entity from the individual that owns it. So if this gets there, and the Supreme Court says that this is a corporation that has religious rights, the veil, the separateness is saying, look, there is no difference here. There is no separateness. The Greens are the Hobby Lobby. The Hobby Lobby are the Greens. So if the Greens sell a product that causes somebody injury or death, I don't just sue the Hobby Lobby. I sue the Greens too because they're the same entity. There is no separateness. This has all types of ramifications like that. Now, here's the point. The Supreme Court probably will try to do everything they can to allow the Hobby Lobby to make this argument without saying that it's based on a constitutional right. They'll try to do the best of both worlds, and it's going to be very difficult for them to do that.
Yeah. Now, I mean, how will they insulate? I mean, we can put aside the question as to whether or not Hobby Lobby is even mandated to have insurance, because they're not. They could pay a tax if they didn't want to, and the idea it would be pretty ironic for people who are supported by the right wing to argue that that's economic coercion when, in fact, you have a third party, that is the women who work there. They are going to lose contraceptive care, which is very coercive, the expense that would be involved in that. But aside from that argument, and aside from the argument as to whether or not this is some type of offense to their religious liberties, or whether or not it's abortion instead of contraception. How could the Supreme Court sort of thread that needle? How could they say they get the same rights as an individual does in terms of religion, but don't get the liability?
They won't base it on religion, Sam. They'll base it on some type of congressional screw up. They'll make it some executive office screw up. They can't go here, is what I'm trying to say. Listen, you had in the peyote case that we talked about in the first segment, there your 1990 Supreme Court decision. They said we're not going to give Native Americans the right to fire up peyote and say that it was part of our religious ceremony. We're not going to do that. As a matter of fact, interesting enough, in that case, you had Scalia, the real bonehead, come out and say, no, we're not going to test. If we allowed this to happen, everybody that had a beef that wanted to base it on religious conviction, they have a religious conviction that they shouldn't pay taxes to anybody, they shouldn't give money to anybody but God. They have a religious belief that nobody in their corporation should have to serve in the military. Well, they could go on forever. So Scalia said, no, we're not going to grant that here. And he made the argument himself. So it's going to be interesting how he justifies himself here. It doesn't make any difference to a guy like Scalia. The guy he's an intellectual fraud. Right. It doesn't make any difference. He'll say one thing one day and another day, just depending on what suits him.
But it will be interesting how a guy like John Roberts, who at the very least, while his agenda may not be terribly different from Scalia's, certainly seems to have more shame and more sort of, I guess, political savvy. It'll be interesting to see how he attempts to thread this needle, because, I mean, frankly, I think it would be pretty good for to see some of that sort of like liability stripped, at least on some level, protection stripped. But it'll be interesting to see how they walk this line, because it is really hard to imagine that a head of a company can know that they're making a car that's going to kill people, not do anything about it, and hide behind
and pay a fine, and nobody goes to jail. Yeah, nobody goes to jail.
Yeah, but at the same time can also say my corporation shares my religion. Just a bizarre dynamic. But we're celebrating some anniversaries around now, and one of them was we're a couple of days late, but nevertheless, it was about a year ago when the Republican Party realized, apparently for the first time, that they had a problem.
They were freaks.
Yeah, they had a problem with young people, black people, brown people, women people, LGBT people, basically
people,
all people who were not elderly and white. Yes.
Yeah.
And so they started their outreach program. They wanted to rebrand the new Republican Party. We are a big tent party. And Ian Millhiser in Think Progress has a pretty good piece outlining how they've done. It doesn't look so good.
No, it's a disaster. Okay, yeah. So they come out and they spend all this. What I think is interesting, they spend all this money. They don't just go, let's do it. They spend a huge amount of money. Leadership says we're so hated. We're so vilified. We're such losers. We're just so weird. We got to figure out why have we become such freaks? And so they do this study and they say, well, here's a reason. It is that we don't treat minorities right. We do everything we can to interfere with their right to live a decent life in the country. And so the first thing you start seeing is that just a couple of weeks ago we talked about Paul Ryan coming out and say that we're in a tailspin because of inner city men that are so lazy that they don't really want to work, and they're a cultural problem. And and then the statement about private ownership should trump African Americans' rights to not be discriminated against. That came from I think Rand Paul. So I mean, immediately we start seeing stupid come out. Well, you pick one. Pick any one of them. I mean.
Well, I mean, let me start with one that's not even on the list. I think because this came out probably just the day afterwards. But there was a new millennial ad that, and I have to say that in terms of like, I mean, these are the reasons why they failed in their outreach. But I mean, they just give you a sense of how tone deaf they are. And we've talked about this dynamic in the past too, where these rebranding things are, first off, they obviously won't change their policies, but the rebranding things, we have talked about how this is basically a racket that exists on the right wing, where some millionaire or billionaire is sitting at a table and says we should do X, Y, or Z, and then all out of the woodwork come a bunch of consultants who say, oh, you're absolutely right, we can do that. Just give me the money and I'll do it. Well, they came out with a millennial ad campaign this week on YouTube, where they have this young guy in his 20s who, for some reason's wearing like a leather coat that's too small for him and looking off camera instead of looking into camera, talking about how he wants there to be more fracking, more drilling, more coal. But this captures the point is that they want to do this rebranding, but they cannot escape their policies, for which are repugnant to all the people that they're trying to sell it to.
Well, even if they had a good consultant, they would have looked at the consultant. Obviously the consultant's just one of them. I mean, right. it has Republican dummy written all over it. And so, but even had he come up with something good, leadership would have had him change it. How about you could go down the list. We talked about, okay, so you talked about race. Talk about millennials that, they're just in terrible shape with millennials. I say millennials, anybody with a brain between 18 and 35 is going, yeah, we get it. You're racist. Right. You don't like women. You want us to work at a Burger King. We get all that. But then it came into, what about women? What was your take on that? Were they coming?
Well, I mean, we had talked earlier in the program about the Hobby Lobby case, and just this notion of how essentially Republicans, do not view it legitimate that women get contraceptive care. They have. They have come down heavily on the side of Hobby Lobby in this case, which basically says it is okay for their bosses, for the boss of these companies to basically say, my religious sensibilities are offended because you're getting contraception from an insurance plan. Therefore, we're going to sue to deny you the right to have access to that type of contraceptive care through an insurance program.
How about the Republicans saying they get pregnant because they get all liquored up when they go to the bar?
Yeah, exactly. Or Mike Huckabee saying, well, we got to look to the government to be the sugar daddy to provide this contraceptive care, as if, saying essentially that women are so slutty that they need the government to provide for their contraceptive. I mean, it's just.
And let's add to this, the OxyContin freak, Rush Limbaugh. And it comes out and says that women, they're talking about building a museum honoring women's. Now, this is the voice of the Republican Party. There's nobody that's Republican more than Rush Limbaugh. He is the voice. I think everybody agrees. If you said who's the voice of the Republican Party, it's Rush Limbaugh. So there's some discussion about
and
building.
I will say, though, to be fair, that's only because Ronald Reagan, you can't hear him at this point because his voice is a bit muffled.
Yeah, otherwise they'd say he's our voice. But right now, Rush is their voice and has been for a decade. And now so Rush comes out, they're talking about building a museum that honors women's accomplishments. And Rush comes out and says, no, they don't need any new museums. They already have museums. They're called malls.
Yep.
This is what he says about women. Now, this is the party that, again, we started this discussion. The autopsy report was because leadership said, how have we become such crazy oddballs? What has happened that we've become so disliked? So they do the autopsy report. Well, we got to do something about women. So this is one about women. Got to do something about minorities. I told you the one about minorities. Those stories about minorities go on forever. The story about
Pap, hold on, wait. Let me just. I don't think their assessment was how have we become such oddballs, because I don't think they have that level of self-awareness. I think what they realized is, how have we got behind the eight ball in terms of the demographic trends? That's what's changed. They have not changed. I mean, this is the same Republican Party we had 10, 15 years ago, in my estimation. They may be a little bit more naked about it. They may have a higher concentration of those people, and maybe they are reflected more in their elected leaders. But what really has happened is that we have the millennials have left them en masse, that minorities have left them en masse, no difference than the past, except for now the demographics are such that those become a bigger voting bloc. So they've got to try to appeal to those people. But at the same time, they go out there knowing that Latinos are making up a larger part of the population. They have fought immigration reform tooth and nail. They have gone out. They know that.
Voter, how about this? They say we're the party of all inclusive. We want to have we own the big tent. Next thing we know, they're coming out with voter suppression laws. I mean, every state where there's a Republican governor, Republican Senate, what are they doing? Trying to keep people away from the polls. So the autopsy report has told them nothing. Halting immigration, the things you just said. Look at what they've done they want to deporting the class of immigrants they call the Dreamers, which are children the children
that came in under no choice of their own. They were brought in by their parents. I mean, I will say this. The part of the reason why they doubled down on that old coot voting strategy is because in 2014, they know that on off-year elections, younger people, minorities, women don't tend to vote as much as they do older people. And so they doubled down on this. And frankly, while the demographics are in the favor of Democrats long term, the Democrats need to offer some type of serious type of policy agenda to drive their voters out. For me, my bet is extending Social Security, and Mark Begich from Alaska, of all places, signed on to that.
They have nothing on the table to drive young voters out.
All right, we got to take a break. We'll talk more about this when we can return.
We perpetuate a culture of crime all the way from Wall Street right down to the main street in our hometowns. It's worse than it has been since FDR took control of the problem and said we can't count on industry taking care of the American labor. They probably have already engaged into some type of criminal cover-up, and the law prohibits the government from even doing anything about it.
Watch America's Lawyer, Mike Papantonio, every Sunday at noon Eastern on Free Speech TV.
So, Pap, when we broke, we were talking about we were sort of checking in on the 1-year anniversary of the Republican autopsy, where they showed that they were losing horribly large cohorts of the American public because of, well, frankly, their policies. They took the wrong lesson from that, or maybe didn't even take any lesson from it. They did the autopsy and then just said, well, we don't really need to pay attention to that. But with that said, we mentioned in the last segment that they're behind the 8 ball in terms of demographic trends. But the reality is, when you're talking about an off-year election like the one that's coming up in November of this year, old people, people who are deluded into feeling that they are the oppressed majority in some fashion, that they're coming for my guns, they're coming for my marriage, they're coming for my property, they're taking my welfare, they're takers, not makers. The young people are, we can't even tell what sex they are anymore, or whatever it is.
They got damn tattoos and earrings.
Yes, exactly. They're going to
show up. Yeah, and add to that. Before the break, we talked about how the 2014. Look at history. First of all, you got Nate Silver saying it ain't going to be easy. All Nate's done is he's looked at the history. You got an economy that's perceived as a bad economy. You have a president that this has unfavorables that are too high.
Yep.
When you take that combination and then you say that the party that's trying to preserve itself doesn't have anything on the ballot to get them out there, you put all of that together, and all of a sudden you've got what? Low turnout for the millennials, low turnout for women, low turnout for minorities, low turnout for people who have any kind of progressive edge at all, and the people that turn out are the stale, male, pale, old, crazy people. I mean, they're gonna be there because they're just they're worked up into a frenzy.
And there's been a lot of talk about how should Democrats respond to Obamacare, and I think that is the most overblown conversation. They should just simply say we need to. It's good. We need to fix more of it, but then they should get off that because there is nobody. There's nobody who they're going to prevent from voting against them, and there's nobody they're going to inspire to vote for them on that topic. What they're going to be able
But isn't that so Democrat, Sam?
It is so Democrat. And I'll tell you something. The one thing that has heartened me this week was Mark Begich. We mentioned this at the end of the last segment. Mark Begich came out this week and said, I'm running on expanding Social Security benefits. And he said, look, this is a policy and a political no-brainer. And it is absolutely the case. And if this guy can do it in a semi-red, purplish Alaska, I don't know what the partisan index is there, but if this guy can do it, it is going to send a message to the rest of the Democrats. There is absolutely no reason, not on a policy basis or in particular a political basis, why you wouldn't be promoting that. That's the type of thing that drives people out
Democrats
to vote.
have the worst advisors ever. It's like I call it the advisor's nepotism. They bring, they go to a firm, they bring up the next guy in the firm, the next woman in the firm. They don't have original ideas. Look, of course Obama won the last election because, Republicans are so hated right now. But if you don't give people a reason to come up in 2014, you're going to get killed. Look, one thing I want to talk about this idea of retirement. These old folks, they're going to be showing up in the 2014 for Republicans, believing that they have something in common with Republicans. Let's talk about what Wall Street, together with Republican and Democratic politicians, are doing to their retirement. This is what they'll be worried about.
Here's the bottom line. And you can listen to the chief market strategist at Oppenheimer, or you can look at any of the studies that have been done. The 401k experiment, this defined contribution but not defined benefit program, has been an unmitigated disaster in terms of setting people up for retirement. You have the percentage of people who have money in their 401ks is minuscule. The amount of money. 36% of workers have less than $1,000 in savings and investments that can be used for retirement.
But Sam, let's talk about how it's happened. Wall Street has bought off all these This is a microcosm of. Let's talk about Rhode Island. Rhode Island, you have what's her name? Is it Gina? I think it's Gina Raimondo.
Democrat, yeah, exactly.
Democrat. Okay, so Governor Gina comes out and says, I've come here to help you, retirees. We're going to get all of your money and move it through the system to where Wall Street controls your money. That's basically what happened. Now, come to find out, her biggest donors were Goldman Sachs, Bain Capital, J.P. Morgan, Chase. They showered her with money to try to get the retirees money.
The state employees' retirement pension accounts. And this has happened in New Jersey as well. What they do is they take these pension accounts, which are obviously their promises, deferred compensation essentially to state employees. These pension accounts have been generally put in very safe, moderate growth accounts. Hedge funders come in and say, hey, we can get you huge returns. And even though it's incredibly risky to do so, and even though we're going to be pulling out exorbitant fees, you've seen this, Pap, the amazing fees that these hedge funders pull out is far greater than traditional fund fees. They do this. They lavish the politician with campaign donations, whether it's the Democratic governor of Rhode Island or the Republican governor, Chris Christie in New Jersey, and then they end up tanking these pension funds for state workers.
Yeah.
It is just all part of the problem. This is why we need to have Democrats come out strong.
Well, this is a Democrat. Raimondo, Rhode Island, she is a Democrat. She's running for governor, and she is bought and paid for by Wall Street to get the money out of the safe pension program into the Wall Street's hands.
So, Pap, there was a big report in Politico this past week, which, Politico is not necessarily known for its in-depth reporting. This was a incredibly well-reported piece by Stephanie Simon. And what she found was that there are 14 states who use nearly $1 billion, $1 billion of taxpayer money to fund creationism in private schools. Essentially, they do this by providing vouchers. And it is incredible. I mean, you will not believe what is being taught in these schools. And this story is one of those stories where you're seeing the broader outlines of an attack on public education writ large, and you're seeing the coalition between the religious fundamentalists and the sort of neoliberal free marketeers who want to privatize everything.
Yeah, George, you got Bush, Jeb Bush, buddy, this is his deal. He's out giving speeches all over the country about this right now. But, okay, so how bad is this? Well, here it is. It had to be required that they teach creationism, that creationism is a science, that mathematics is a law that's ordained by God, created by God, ordained by God, that the evolution is a wicked, vain philosophy. These are all things that are coming out of the books, the textbooks, that you as a taxpayer, if you're listening to this right now, are paying for. And one way this has happened is because, ground zero for crazy is Texas right now. It has been for a long time. But most of these textbooks are written for the Texas values because they have so many schools in Texas. So they write for Texas values, and now the voucher program is making taxpayers are paying for this in kind of a double whammy, aren't they?
It's a double whammy, and I got to tell you, ground zero for those textbooks may be Texas, but ground zero for this program seems to be Florida.
That's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringofireradio.com, on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio, and on Facebook. I'm Farron Cousins, and we'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.